How about your current company? Could you tell us a little bit about that? And how do you like your job as a CEO?
Wow, that's a tough question. I worked at Google and I was responsible for a big part of the Google Assistant. I was part of the team that launched the Google Assistant to market both on the smart speaker, mobile devices. And a big reason why I was on that team is because I had all the experience from building textual analytics and networks and associations at IBM Research, which was back then not called machine learning, but you could classify it as machine learning. When I worked at IBM Research, there was not enough data or users to really deploy an AI to help. Not many people had cell phones and they weren't as powerful as they are today. So the market was not ready yet for an AI to be in the home. There was no, it wasn't the time for you to have Alexa in the kitchen. And then when Google Assistant came around and project started and they recruited me to work on the project, the time was obviously ready because Alexa had already existed and was taking off, and Google wanted to catch up with that market. So I was very excited about it. But a big component of it was, how do we make money from this technology by selling advertising? How do we monetize the investment in the AI? How do we increase the top line revenue? And at that point, I asked myself a question: do I want to work on AI to sell advertising, or do I want to do something else? And I had a strong reaction to that and wanted to really use the technology to help people. And there's lots of areas where you can do that. Healthcare is one of them. There's a lack of people in healthcare. There's understaffing in nursing and administrative functions in healthcare. Healthcare is a really big industry in the US. We spend more than $3 trillion on healthcare every year, and it's the fastest growing part of our economic burden. It's also unfortunately, the fastest increasing cost that contributes to our debt. I think there's a lot of opportunity for AI to reduce cost, especially on the administrative side, and to improve access to care for patients when there is no human available. I don't think there's a future where you would go into a room and talk to a box and it's replacing the doctor or the nurse. But I do think there are burdens on the doctor and the nurse that you can alleviate with an AI so they can focus on seeing more patients or being better at what they do serving the patient. And so I started a company. We ended up focusing entirely on healthcare. And it's been a really interesting journey because healthcare is a very tough market. It's first of all regulated, so it's challenging to navigate all the regulations as a small tech company. And two, the buying process in healthcare is very convoluted. There are basically three big players in healthcare: pharmaceutical companies who make the drugs, payers, the insurance companies who end up paying for interventions, procedures, doctor visits, etc., and then the health systems that actually deliver the care. Most doctors in the US, and there's about 800,000 practicing physicians in the US, are associated with a health system. And so the only way to get care is to go through a health system to get to the doctor. And the way that health buys technology is very different from any other company. It's complicated. It's a very in-person sales process. Sales cycles are really long, 6 to 12 months, maybe longer. And it's a very traditional business. And so having an impact as a small company is really challenging. And so all of those things lead up to, well, how is it to be a CEO? I would answer that question by splitting into two parts. Being a CEO of a startup is hard and can be lonely sometimes. There are a lot of decisions that startups needs to make that you don't have specific personnel for. So in the beginning, you may not have marketing, or you may not have a full sales team. Or if you do, they may be junior. And so you ultimately get to be the decider, which sounds really exciting, but can be very exhausting. Typically, even if you have co-founders, ultimately the CEO who reports to the board has to make the final decision. And raising money is always the CEO's job. He has to, or she has to, ultimately focus on pushing the funding agenda. And that is challenging, even though it looks like from the press that there's tons of money. There's still a lot of checks and balances on getting venture funding into a company. So being a CEO is challenging and lonely sometimes, but it's very rewarding when you do have success. I think being a health tech CEO is a completely different job from what I'm used to, being a co-founder in 2 previous companies. And if you're an outsider, it's even harder. And this has been a very interesting journey for me because it's been very humbling. Success in a tech company doesn't automatically translate into healthcare. There's no guarantee. And in fact, there's very little that you learn from technology business that you can translate into a healthcare business. And so it's been, I feel very much like a junior CEO as opposed to a real CEO at the company now, because there's so much that you have to learn to be able to thrive in healthcare.
I bet learning yourself is also exciting for you because I see that, by listening to you for your experience so far, this is where the career and passion come together. You just provided great examples for our students. And I wanted to move on a little bit. When I actually reached out to you a month ago, that you were super busy. But when I mentioned my class, Innovation to Market, and then the ocean chat about the subject of entrepreneurship, you had no hesitation to taking extra curriculum. So as much as you describe a CEO job, I'm also wondering, how do you decide where to spend your time these days?
That is an ongoing challenge. There are a lot of different ways that I can spend my time. But over the years, because of my personal experience starting companies or being a manager or director in a large corporation, I've learned that it is hard to find mentors and good examples of good management style. And the people who have dedicated time to help me progress in my career and in my learning have always had an ethos of giving back. And so I'm trying to repay what somebody else did for me by making myself more available to be able to share my experience and potentially even mentor people. There are great schools out there that teach very important fundamentals in business management and product management to some degree, engineering, of course. But there are a lot in between the gaps between I would say, classical training and boots on the ground when you're starting a company. And even if you did have a really good class that taught you potential skills or tools to solve a problem, when you're actually in it, it's very hard to take a step back and see all of the possible solutions. And so having somebody there that can guide you through that process, or even just being a champion for you, even if they don't know the answer, is really helpful. And being pragmatic about education on startups and companies and what's the right choice for young people, I think is something that we should do more of.
Fantastic. Thank you again, for spending time with us here. I think it means a lot to our students. I would like to read a short paragraph from an HBR article. There is an essential intangible something in startups, an energy, a soul. Company founders sense its presence. So do earlier employees and customers. It inspires people to contribute their talent, money, and foster a sense of deep connection and mutual purpose. So, Kobus, in your opinion, what is the soul of a startup?
I think the soul of a startup sounds really cool because it's something that's like Twitterable, right? You can like tweet it and then people will respond. I think it's important to understand what that means. And from the prompt, the poll that's on the screen right now, it's specifically asking what is the most important piece that holds people together and lifts the spirit of the startup. I've been in 5 startups and large companies. Google has an interesting culture because every new project is kind of a mini startup. Android was kind of a startup. They were really well funded and resourced and left alone to do what they needed to do. Payments, similar. Verily, which was the medical device arm that grew out of Google X, was similarly very much a startup. In my experience, what has held together startups or small teams that are trying to innovate is the leadership. There's always one person that is pushing, or a group of people that's pushing really, really hard to move things forward and keep everything together. But what enables them to do that is equally important. I've seen a lot of leaders with passion and great people that have completely failed because they didn't have a good product. I have seen a lot of people who had great product ideas but was underfunded, and they failed miserably because they didn't have enough resources to execute. So in my mind, it's really three things. Do you have the right team that can build the right product or a great product with enough funding to be able to succeed? And I used to tell my early teams when I later in my career, when I started after I left VMware, the very first project that I was on at Google was mobile payment, and our responsibility was to launch the first commercially available phone in the world that allows you to download your credit card to your phone and pay at a Whole Foods or a Walgreens. And it was very ambitious because at that time there was no terminal infrastructure in the US that could do mobile payment. None of the checkout lanes at like an Old Navy or a Pete's would take the phone signal. And so the first challenge was we had to roll out payment terminals across the US to be able to make this happen. And of course, when we went to the payment terminal companies, they said, well, we don't have payment terminals that do this. So we had to actually build it for them. And then on the phone side, Google did release phones, Nexus phones, with its own branding. But ultimately, that was made by LG or Samsung. This is public knowledge. And so we still had to convince those companies to modify their phones to be able to build this feature. And we would not have succeeded if we didn't have great leadership to push through all those challenges. And we wouldn't have succeeded if the product wasn't enticing for end users to actually use. And we had enough money to, for example, roll out thousands of terminals or modify phones. But I always told my teams that the most important thing for you to do for the leadership responsibility is survive your first birthday. Like if you can make it from launch to your first birthday after launch, that's a really good indication that you're going to succeed. And the startup statistics really back this up. A lot of startups fail in the first year or shortly thereafter. And if you can launch a product, find enough traction, and make it for 12 months, then you have a very good chance of getting somewhere. But if after the first 12 months, you don't have enough traction or product market fit, you're not going to be successful.
So 1 year anniversary, if that happens, that's a really happy birthday.
Yeah, I think it's a really important milestone for small teams and startups.
So Kobus, you have worked in many regulated industry, healthcare being one. You also worked on life science project. So tell us a little more about the challenges and some of the advice that you would for our audience that how do they navigate within a regulated industry?
Well, I've worked in financial regulation. All the products that we shipped at Google for mobile payment was heavily regulated. And it wasn't just financial regulation, but also industry regulation. So the industry also have standards. Both Visa, MasterCard, Discover have different standards that you had to adhere to. They had their own certification processes. You couldn't, for example, download a Visa card onto your phone if Visa doesn't approve it. And for them to approve it, they had to make sure that the phone and the terminal works. So you can imagine how complicated it is if you go to an organization like Visa and says 100,000 terminals in the US is certified. What does that mean? How does that work? I guess to give you a quick answer, if you want to work in a regulated industry as part of a team, make sure that that team has enough experience to succeed in that business. I wouldn't recommend joining a team that has no prior experience in that field. So if you're going to do something, for example, in mobile payment, don't join a team that hasn't successfully shipped a product in the financial space. But if you want to start a business and you lack regulatory experience, you don't have to not start the business. There are resources for you to go to. A lot of the regulated businesses, even though there are large companies that operate in them and have their own regulatory internal function, there are tons of consultants and firms that specialize in helping you navigate regulation. For example, in healthcare, there are tons of companies that can help you set up a quality management system or help you navigate the FDA device approval process. And so it's not a barrier that should prevent you from starting a business, but you have to be very careful because bringing a team on board in a regulated business is much more expensive endeavor than starting a business in a non-regulated industry. That is probably the number one reason why companies in regulated or startups in regulated businesses fail, because they underestimate the cost of building out the regulatory function and navigating the regulatory space in addition to building their product. And so it's kind of like be careful on how you make that decision.
Is it fair to say that if it's a regulated industry, if you're able to successfully manage the system and get your technology or your product into it, then that's a higher entry barrier for your competitors?
Absolutely. Going through any regulatory process is usually very challenging and creates a kind of a moat around your business that helps you be more sustainable. Something that's also very interesting about regulated businesses is that buyers of regulated software or hardware typically sign 3 to 5 year deals. And so if you operate in a regulated business, you can now look for money based on 3 to 5 year projections. And the investors are more likely to believe your projections because that's just fundamentally how the business works. Enterprise sales have that reliability to it in regulated businesses that you don't find in other businesses. There's more of a loyalty to your regulated or compliant product.
That's great.